So in 1908, Christian philosopher Gilbert Chesterton published the book Orthodoxy, which I would highly recommend due to being packed with hidden gems. One such example is the following quote: "Poetry is sane because it floats easily in an infinite sea. Reason seeks to cross the infinite sea and so make it finite. The result is mental exhaustion. To accept everything is an exercise, to understand everything is a strain. The poet only desires exaltation and expansion, a world to stretch himself in. The poet only asks to get his head into the heavens. It is the logician who seeks to get the heavens into his head, and it is his head that splits." It may seem counterintuitive at first, but there is a tremendous amount of freedom and grace when one becomes comfortable with probabilistic infinity. In fact, science hints that on a daily basis, we exist at the edges or interfaces of infinity. So I'd like to briefly talk about how to use scientific thinking to give yourself an endless world of possibility to stretch yourself in like a poet, without disregarding scientific logic. The subdisciplines of science and engineering tend to focus their gaze on a specific subsection of the universe or multiverse, and conceptually isolate the subregion into a system for further understanding system structure and behavior. However, there are some conceptual systems that interface with our direct experiences that are essentially infinite compared to what we are capable of experiencing, and therefore, by definition, break down traditional conceptual system walls and stretch them out to infinity, or maybe a kind of quasi-infinity. In other words, there are some conceptual regions established through scientific and mathematical study that when you peer into these regions, or windows to infinity, you find they essentially stretch out forever. So I'd like to very briefly discuss two of them from a more abstract, higher level overview today, and encourage people to dive into them further if interested. The first is the infinity of thought. You might recall that moving or accelerating a charged particle creates electromagnetic field disturbances at the speed of light. So once you remember that thinking relies heavily on moving charged particles around, specifically on charged particles oscillating across neuron axons, to transmit the electrochemical information that underlies the process of thinking, one quickly comes to understand that if you are constantly moving, accelerating, and stopping charged particles when you think, then you are constantly creating perturbations in the massive and predominantly invisible ocean of the electromagnetic field. Now, on the one hand, these disturbances tend to be very energetically weak and easily disturbed by environmental barriers like the skull and other objects. And since objects tend to act more like faint field disturbances instead of sharp electromagnetic waves, you probably won't find your mind breaking into your local radio channel anytime soon. But that doesn't mean your thoughts don't create tiny ripples in the universe propagating outwards at the speed of light. So it can be quite exciting to realize that such a core part of your being interfaces with infinity and with things much greater and incomprehensible to an individual, opening the door to lots of fascinating possibilities and interactions. I sometimes wonder why the general public doesn't talk more about this fascinating physical and potentially metaphysical phenomenon, because I'm fairly certain that some entities are indeed quite interested in this. But that rabbit hole may not be worth pursuing without special access, at least until AI gets involved. Anyway, the other expansive topic I wanted to bring up is the infinity of spatial dimensionality. Once you jump from 3 dimensions of space to 4 dimensions of space and time, the degrees of freedom in which you could move and the amount of new room you would have to do so opens up an almost infinite amount of space compared to what you were previously confined to. And if you add on additional layers of dimensionality, such as probabilities or phase space, which might be thought of abstractly as the landscape of possibility, you once again have this enormous explosion of new room to move about, compared to when you were only restricted to space and time, and so on and so forth. Physicists use dimensional representations higher than 3D space or 4D spacetime to model the phenomena all around us, all the time. And even 1 or 2 dimensional degrees of freedom above what we are capable of directly experiencing grants a nearly infinite amount of new space to explore compared to what we are used to, which means we could very easily be omnidirectionally surrounded by infinity, not somewhere out there in the great depths of the universe, but literally all around us. When you conceptually pair this with the infinity of thought, you realize that the nexus of our being sits in an essentially infinite communication medium that has the potential to ripple information through an essentially infinite amount of dimensional space in lots of unexpected ways. Therefore, by exploring conceptually expansive scientific topics like these, where it's basically impossible for a single human mind to gauge in the boundaries of these systems, one is pushed to see that they live at the edge of infinity every day and are forced to consider the possibility that there might be things out there much greater than us.